I'm Gerd Hammerschmidt, professor at the center and was also the founding director of the center. And it's a big honor, pleasure for me to welcome today's speaker. And it's really terrific that we have Helen Margetts with us. I think you hardly need a bigger introduction, but Helen is Professor of Society and the Internet at the Oxford University of Oxford. She has been for many years, the director of the very famous, renowned Oxford Internet Institute, which for us as the Center of Digital Governance has always been the benchmark where we would aim for, was really an orientation point. And from the beginning on, we tried very often to find linkages with the work at this really great Oxford Internet Institute. Helen Margetts is a very renowned and extremely productive. I was really impressed, Helen, by your publication line coming up. It's so impressive, and she's really Helen is doing a lot of research on government digitalization, but also increasingly on the use of AI in government. We all are very much aware about your publications, and there are core readings in all our courses, this digital era governance argument. So we are observing different phases of how digitalization is affecting government, is changing governance structures in digitalization. And Helen today will present, the title of the presentation is Building Progressive Public Services with Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. That's, of course, a topic we are all extremely interested in. I think you will summarize 3 of your existing papers, which I think is a wonderful idea. And without much more further on, I would maybe shortly to introduce the format. Most of you are familiar with it. We start with a half an hour presentation by our guest speaker, and then we have half an hour for a Q&A session. We will have a recording of the presentation itself, but not of the Q&A discussion afterwards. For the discussion, I very much ask you for discipline, short on. Also raise your hand in the, with the hands up in the MS Teams. I will then give you the voice. I would really ask you for short questions so that many of us can come in with questions. And I'm very much looking forward to an exciting, stimulating exchange. And it's really a great pleasure, honor, Helen, to have you with us here, and pass over to you. The floor is yours, and we are thrilled to listen to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Gerhard, and thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me. Of course, it's a great pleasure to be here. I can't see anybody yet because I'm sharing my slides, but as soon as I've finished talking, then I will unshare them and we'll be able to see you, which will also be a pleasure. As Gerhard said, I'm a professor in the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. A few years ago, I started also working at the Alan Turing Institute for Data Science and AI, where I set up a program of research to try to help governments maximize the possibilities of data science and AI for the public sector. The reason for that was because, as some of you will know, I've been working on this area for a very long time, since before anybody was interested in it, apart from me and my supervisors. And obviously it's changed a huge amount since then, and lots of people are interested in the topic of digital government broadly defined. The idea of the research at the Turing Institute is really to put some kind of, to try and put some of these ideas into practice and really help governments with these technologies. I'm going to talk about both some of the academic work that Gerhard has mentioned, but also some of that work at the Turing Institute where we're practically trying to help governments. I'll speak to these 3 articles. One is the first one is Data Science, Artificial Intelligence, and the Third Wave of Digital Era Governance, where Patrick Dunleavy and I try to update our model of digital era governance, which was first published in 2006, a long time ago in AI time. And we try and update that model for the latest wave of technologies, i.e. these data-intensive technologies, data science and AI. The second article is one on the political economy of digital government, where we look at the changing public-private relationships that have long existed in the delivery of digital government. I wrote my PhD about those back in the 1990s. And it's interesting to think how they've changed over time, which they have, particularly in the last 15 years or so. And the third article comes out of that more practical stream of work. As I hope you all know, we have a new government here in the UK. That's very exciting for us. We're perhaps no longer quite the joke of Europe that we have been for many years. And that article is kind of geared at the new government, and we are talking to quite a few people in the government about it, about how you actually do it, how you actually build better public services with these technologies. So I'll try to talk to all three of those. I've not done that before, so please bear with me. I hope it works, but hopefully we can have a good discussion anyway. So just to go back a minute in time, it's important to realise where we come from when we talk about digital government. Governments around the world have a long history of struggling with technological innovation. There's just three examples here. One is the Affordable Care Act in the US, Obama's flagship policy on providing healthcare across the population of the US. That the website set up to deliver that crashed within minutes of opening up. Hotshots from Silicon Valley had to be brought in to kind of save the website, and indeed the program as a whole, which kind of floundered on that early disaster. Universal credit in the UK, again, a flagship policy of the Conservative government, the biggest welfare reform since Beveridge. Hundreds of millions of pounds spent on a system that never worked. It has to be replaced twice before something that could actually deliver these benefits came into operation. My Health Record in Australia, again, a flagship policy to do something about the very messy, fragmented and disaggregated data environment over health in Australia. Again, floundered in the early days due to lack of trust in the system, lack of opt-in from Australian citizens, and so on. All big projects to deliver flagship policies which just threatened to fail. In governments like the UK in particular, the situation is different in Europe for reasons we'll discuss. A lot of these problems come from public-private relationships. Government's relationship with huge global computer services providers, so-called systems integrators that promise to sort everything out from one department or another with a massive, what we now call legacy computer systems. A particular notable example is the post office scandal, based on a computer system for post office accounting developed by the systems integrator Fujitsu. The system provided false information about post office managers' accounts. Hundreds, even thousands of post office managers were accused of false accounting. Many of them went to prison. Some of them committed suicide. It ruined the system, and the fallout from the failure of this system ruined a lot of people's lives. Of course, other things were at fault, not least the post office, and we could talk for hours about that. But the point is, at the heart of it was a system, a computer system, which the post office trusted more than they trusted their own staff when it came to the veracity of information. And those systems are still there in government. In the UK, Fujitsu still is running the same system for the post office even now, and still has charge over the data. So it's not that any of these things have gone away. It's important to recognise that they're there. And partly for that reason, and other reasons connected with bureaucracies because of capacity to innovate with technology, those struggles that governments have had with technology has continued really up until the 2010s. And I've pointed to four particularly relevant, I feel, characteristics here. One is this lack of in-house expertise. Governments used to be leaders in the development of information technologies back in the 50s and 60s. But as these systems were progressively outsourced to computer services providers like Capgemini, Fujitsu, and so on, at least those are their names now, they lost any information, any capability in government. That's one of the issues. Another issue is that government has no tradition of using transactional data or its own sort of treasure troves of data of its interactions with citizens and government to improve its own services. And these systems really just kind of replicated the situation of filing cabinets and paper systems in terms of actually generating usable data. They just didn't generate data that could be used to feed into public policy and service improvement. That was a kind of passive information regime. The key ways that government is used to measure its activity or measure societal trends and patterns in the world outside, it's been one of Sorry? Hello?
Sorry, Helen, that was somebody who entered the call and wasn't muted. Please continue.
Okay.
Sorry for that.
Okay, sorry about that. So that was really the situation for many years after successive generations of technology had made other things possible, a kind of passive information regime based on official statistics and performance metrics of the way of understanding the world outside and how to improve policy. And then finally, there was a real resistance. If we think about where data science and artificial intelligence technologies came from, they came from the great big data intensive platforms of Silicon Valley, Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, and so on. They came from these platforms. That's where these technologies have been sort of developed and honed and are ever continuing waves of innovation. And public sectors really kind of saw themselves as separate from this. They didn't see these innovations having huge relevance for government. We explain how that happened in the paper on the third wave of digital era governance. So what I want to say here is that these technologies offer huge possibilities for a new kind of way of doing digital government, from escaping from these legacies, for reducing dependence, for developing active information regimes, if it can be done. So if that's what we want, to happen, what should we prioritize? And I think here, we have to think about the opportunities and the challenges, and what should be the priorities for governing in the age of these technologies. And these are what I'm proposing should be the priorities originating from our article on progressive public services: productivity, equity, and governance. And I'll deal with each of those in turn. So starting with productivity. Productivity is what everybody talks about when we talk about data science and then AI. There's always a McKinsey report, right, that says you can save trillions of pounds with these technologies. And when it comes to the public sector, it's important to remember that the public sector is a huge chunk of the economy. In the UK, it's about 20% of the UK's economy's output. So that public sector productivity is something that we really might hope a lot for from these technologies. And when I say productivity, I don't just mean saving money. In fact, I would say that has been one of the other driving factors of government's problem with technology, has been the emphasis always on saving money, making it cheaper, not better. So when I talk about productivity, I think it should be about improving decision making in both service delivery and policy making. But productivity is a very good hook to attract these technologies to policymakers, because of course governments all around the world, and particularly the new Labour government in the UK, is aimed at kind of making public services better, but not spending any more money on them. So productivity is very likely to be the game in town. I'll talk about two aspects of that. One is improving services, and one is improving policy making. Starting with services, most of public services are about making decisions about whether somebody can have a passport or a permit or a license or a benefit or a tax subsidy or things completely life-changing like asylum to immigrate to or to immigrate to a country. They're about decisions, but every single decision the public sector makes is about a series of what we might call microtransactions. Things like checking a photograph, triaging text in a document, checking two documents against each other. And it's these microtransactions that are highly automatable. In the past, when we talked about automating public sector tasks, we've tended to think about it in a very lumpy way. Think about automating whole transactions. That's quite a risky way to do it, because what if the processes change? What if the policy changes? We believe that a much more achievable methodology would be to think about these kind of single complex repetitive transactions which happen over and over again in all sorts of service processes. And one of the things we have done in the work at the Turing Institute is develop a methodology for doing that. The paper's there if anybody's interested to read it. It hasn't got the most attractive title in the world, and you might say it's not the stuff that dreams are made on. But we do believe that there would be a methodology there for any government department or collection of departments to look at all their processes and identify these transactions that could be these microtransactions, that could be easily automated. And that could make a big difference to productivity, particularly with the advent of generative AI and large language models. Excuse me, and we might talk about that in the discussion. We've done some research on that as well. What about public sector? What about policy making? How can we make policy making? There's no doubt that most governments do a lot of policy making. I mean, there's the UK budget, 52,000 policy decisions, allocating £1 trillion worth of public money every year. And these technologies offer a great many ways of thinking about making policy decisions that we believe could really help with policy making. These are just some examples of some projects that our kind of modelling for policy team has done in the Turing work. And here it's really about thinking, remember the pandemic. In the pandemic, all sorts of policy interventions were introduced at speed. Things like lockdowns, social distancing rules, furlough schemes, loan schemes, school closures, all sorts of rules about the way that we live our lives. And there was a lot of modelling, there's no doubt about it. You know, there were politicians showing PowerPoint slides on national television. Everybody was talking about R numbers and things like that. But it was nearly all kind of epidemiological modelling. There was very little modelling that tried to understand the complex interplay between different policy sectors. And that means that policies like furlough schemes were introduced really without any idea of what the consequences might be or what the unintended consequences might be. And there's a great deal of scope for using data science methodologies combined with machine learning and methodologies that would purport to be called AI to build models that allow you to simulate policy interventions before they're put into place. And that's what I'm talking about here. So one example is the work on labour mobility, which tries to build a model for labour mobility and labour flow networks. That's the kind of thing that would enable you to understand how a furlough scheme is going to work, what sort of incentives it's going to create, what kind of behavioural change it's going to bring. There's a lot of scope there. And the other thing is about the optimization of resources. Looking at the last the last bar on that, the last column on that slide. One of my colleagues, Omar Guerrero, has built a policy prioritization model, which is being used in developing countries to try and understand what's the optimal resource allocation to meet sustainable development goals. I mean, a very simplistic way, it's not a simplistic model, but a simplistic way to think about that is if you want to improve education in a country, you might think, well, I should put all the resources into education, but sick children can't study, so perhaps some of the money should go into children's health. It's a way of tackling decisions like that, the kind of decisions that are made every year in the budget that a government makes, to try and optimize resource allocation going forward. I think there's a lot of untapped scope in there for most governments. So that's productivity. But if you're thinking about productivity as one of the most hopeful benefits of data science and AI, equity is one of the most feared harms, and it pops up everywhere when you're talking about these technologies. There's a real risk that in the future we're going to see a kind of paradox of plenty, where smaller and smaller groups of powerful individuals and organizations achieve the most benefits from these technologies, and the harms fall disproportionately on vulnerable populations. So it's really something to think about when we're thinking of improving the public sector. The now Nobel Prize winning economist Aaron Acemoglu has shown extensively how, for example, automation of tasks in private and public sectors leads to greater wage inequality. And we see that replicated over and over again when these technologies are embedded in organizations. And for the public sector, that's particularly important. There's two key ways, I think, that we need to think about that. One of them is in terms of participatory equity. These technologies are kind of landed on people from on high, particularly with the latest wave of innovations, large language models, for example, which kind of appeared, ChatGPT kind of appeared from nowhere in 2022, massive implications for all sorts of areas of society. And I think it's possible for the public, for citizens, to feel as if these technologies are kind of like sweeping over them like a wave. And that could easily happen with the use of AI in the public sector as well, making, reinforcing a lot of kind of ideas that people might have about the public sector, about being bound by rules and impersonal and unhelpful and so on. So I think thinking about the kind of science of public involvement in these technologies and the use of these technologies is really important. We have just in the field now with a second survey to understand how people are experiencing AI in the real world. And I think that's a really important thing to do, but it needs to go much deeper than that. It needs to include things like citizens' juries and citizens' assemblies and the much beleaguered focus group, to try and understand what people expect, what they're frightened of, what they're hopeful about from these technologies if we want to make the most of them in the public sector. And then there's also the question of how these technologies both reveal and can reinforce deeply embedded societal inequities wherever they are. A couple of examples there. This is some research we did recently that suggested that over 3/4 of women do not feel comfortable expressing political opinions online. That's much higher for women than it is for men. And it seems highly likely that all the time is being reinforced by data science and AI technologies on social media platforms and public platforms of all kinds. These are the things we're going to have to monitor if we want to understand AI's reaction with society. There's also the question of, we talk about the need for capability and expertise in data science and AI and innovation and so on, but who's doing that? Who's got the expertise? Who's doing the innovation? This result, the figure on the right is a rather terrifying figure from a report we did recently on women in venture capital, showing that all the venture capital money is focused on one particular societal group. And how it seems to exclude women, for example, and of course other societal groups as well. If anybody's interested in that work, it's carried out by our Women in Data Science and Women in Data Science and AI project at the Turing, freely available. Okay, I've talked about two of the priorities that I think we have to have if we want to think about the public sector maximizing the benefits of these technologies. We also have to think about managing the challenges. And these are questions of governance. When we think about governance, we tend to end up talking about regulation very quickly and forget about all the other things that we might do to govern a sort of data science powered world. When I think about this, I always think about the UK Online Safety Act, which was brought into force relatively recently. Okay, that's quite a path-breaking piece of regulation. Other countries have done it too. We were talking about it for 7 years before we actually had it in practice. If we'd not done anything else, then obviously we would have just been talking for the 7 years. So when we talk about governing AI in the wider world, when we talk about the issue of governance of AI as opposed to AI for governance, we really have to think about a lot of other things. We have to think about ethics and responsible innovation, embedding normative principles in the design of AI, in the development and the application and its use in the public sector. Of course, we often don't get the chance to do that with respect to the private sector, but when it comes to the public sector, it should be possible. And of course, we do have to think about how to tackle the question of governing these technologies in the private sector as well. That has to take place at all levels. It has to take place at international levels, national levels, local levels, and so on. We also need to talk about standards. It's not a very fashionable topic, but people are talking more and more about it at the moment. We set up the AI Standards Hub at the Turing Institute with the National Physical Laboratory, the British Standards Institute, and the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology. And I think we're going to hear more and more about standards going forwards because it is, in some instances, an alternative to regulation. And it's crucially important anyway that when we talk about governing AI, that we work out that we're all talking about the same thing. When we talk about evaluating models, are we all talking about evaluating them to the same standards? These discussions are crucially important. And then, of course, there is regulation, and we could talk about that for hours. I'm not going to talk about it for hours now, but you'll be glad to know. But with respect to the public sector, it is important to remember that this is a real need for capability in the public sector. It's a really technical field. These are some of the things that we've been doing, trying to sort of help government agencies and regulators govern data science and AI with data science and AI, because you can't really do it without. You need, as I was just talking about, evaluations for understanding the harm potential in generative models. You need new AI-powered methods of content moderation. You need to think about how LLMs can work to generate counter speech and other measures to confront online hate and so on. And that leads to a real question of capacity for the public sector. As I've said, it's a highly technical task to govern and to regulate these technologies. This was a report we wrote on common regulatory capacity for AI, thinking about what that kind of common regulatory capacity that all regulators need, but it doesn't seem right that they should all develop the same capacity. There's over 100 regulators in the UK, and many of them are quite small. They're not going to be able to get hold of that kind of capacity. So how can we think of the kind of governing capacity we need at the government AI level that can then be used by different regulators? And this brings me to a really important point, which is that data science and AI, they're horizontal technologies. They get into everything, every area of society and the economy. As I've just said, every regulator is to some extent a technology regulator now for whatever market they're trying to regulate. But these technologies are also vertical. That is, there's distinct opportunities and challenges in different sectors, requiring domain expertise. If you want to understand labour mobility, as I was talking about before, you need some expertise in labour economics, some expertise in thinking about that sector of the economy. So that sets up a real challenge for government, which I'll talk about in the final part of my talk. Just one point on these priorities here. We wrote the article on progressive public services before the Labour government came in. I'm pleased to say, though, that when their manifesto came out, it did rather reflect what we were talking about here. We've been talking about AI ad nauseum in the UK for the last few years. In the spring budget under the last government, AI was mentioned 43 times. Now, with the new government, we're seeing a much more I think a much more measured approach and an understanding of AI as the latest in a continuum of digital technologies. And I do think that's important. As someone who's been looking at it a long time, I welcome that approach. So AI was only mentioned 3 times in the last budget and the one we've just had. And this statement from the manifesto does reflect that kind of quite careful hope for these technologies, deliver data-driven public services while maintaining strong safeguards and ensuring all of the public benefit. A kind of welcome recognition of these 3 priorities. Okay, well, just to end, because I can see we're at 11:30. Are we at 11:33? Yes. I want to end by thinking about, like, how do we get there? I've said all these great things that might happen, and I've said some of the challenges, but, you know, how do we get there? How do we help governments acquire the right sort of expertise, the right kind of capacity, and kind of reorganize, even rethink functional allocation in this new era? And this comes from that series of work on digital era governance, of which the article I mentioned is the most recent incarnation. And sorry. So here, I wanted to pick up on that horizontal and vertical nature of these technologies that I just mentioned. And I think, in a way, the kind of main themes of the new article and indeed the new book that we're currently finishing reflect that kind of horizontal and vertical nature. And it also goes back to the point I made at the beginning about government's information regime, and how it could be so much more active than it used to be, how it could really reflect the new possibilities for using data to make policy and services better. So those kind of modelling techniques that I talked about are really the secret to a kind of data-intensive information regime, where you're actually using the data that government has itself, rather than having kind of custom-built statistics like inflation that you measure year on year in exactly the same way, with all the flaws, as David Lazar and his group have called 20th century indicators of what's happening in society when they could be so different. I think that kind of modelling is the kind of thing you need to get what we might call a data-intensive information regime, where government finally uses its own data to improve itself and to improve well-being across society. Then there's the question of what, and that's really going to happen at a vertical level. It requires domain expertise, as I've said. And the kind of model we talk about in the new work is an intelligence center devolved delivery structure within vertical sectors, where you have that kind of intelligence center, that active information regime, which can use data to improve services at the front line and improve services at the local level. I think robotics plays a key role here, and we talk quite a lot about that in the book. There isn't time to go into it now, but very happy to discuss if anybody's particularly interested in robotics. We are seeing robotics entering the public sector, particularly ironically in sort of warfare and then in health. And the idea that you've got some kind of intelligence center which can deliver the right information to both people and machines working on the front line is a very important one. And finally, this kind of horizontal nature of these technologies. We've got to find ways of thinking about where we do need to have some kind of administrative holism right across government. And I think the area of governance is one in particular. So I mentioned the question of common regulatory capacity for AI, where we try and build regulatory capacity right across the public sector so that it can feed into individual regulators and individual domains. That might apply to digital government more generally, the kind of administrative capability that we need to be able to help. And the new government in the UK, to be fair, is setting up a new digital government centre right at the centre. The idea is that it helps departments and agencies roll these technologies out. So you can see them beginning to think about these kind of issues. And, oh, sorry. I think finally, this question I raised at the beginning about Silicon Valley and about systems integrators and how embedded in government they are and how they've shaped the history of digital government. They're still there, I have to say. In the UK anyway, they're still there and still having a lot of influence, although government agencies are progressively, with the use of these technologies, particularly cloud provision, pulling away from them. But we do have major new players in digital government now. This is the UK government's AI Safety Summit in Bletchley Park, which was held last November. There's been one in Korea since, there'll be one in France in February. But I was at this summit on the first day, no academics much on the second day. But this is the second day where the kind of leaders, the policymakers were supposed to be. You can see there that there are some people you recognise and there are some leaders of state there. But they are vastly outweighed by the leaders of technology companies, some of which you recognise, quite a few of whom you won't. And these companies are hugely influential in government here. I mentioned large language models, for example, and the advent of ChatGPT, the first kind of interaction with AI that the general public were exposed to, released into society with very little warning, with no guardrails, making a huge difference to both private, but importantly, every single public sector. And that's something we're really going to have to think about going forward, the way that these companies are going to be influencing trends and patterns in public administration. And with that, thank you. I'm going to stop there because I always have to end with a quote from Alan Turing, and I think this is a particularly important one to end with, because there's a lot of talk about AI and existential risk and killing our future and so on. And of course, we should research those issues, but I think it's hugely important to think about what we need to do now. Thank you.